Thank you so much to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Hello everyone, it is time for one of the most exciting videos of the year, and that is my best books of 2023 or my favorite books of 2023. I have so many books to talk to you about, and every year I don't love picking a top 10 or a top however many books you want to pick because I always have such a difficult time choosing a base number, but what I love doing is putting my favorite books in different categories, just because I feel like you get a better idea of the different types of books that I read and the ones that really stood out to me in certain categories. First and foremost, I would love for you guys to let me know what your favorite books are in all of these different categories. You can add your own categories. I will leave a little outline of all the different categories in my description box, so you can copy and paste that and put it in a comment. I always love seeing all of your favorite books and what you've been reading, so definitely leave that in a comment so that we can all see all of our favorite books of 2023. So anyway, my first two honorable mentions are actually two books that I don't have physical copies of. The first one is Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. This was my first Kafka that I read this year, and I absolutely loved it. I was so blown away by his writing style, by the story, the themes that were addressed in the book. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail just because this video will be ages and ages long, but I will link in the description box and in some of the cards some videos where you can hear me talk more about the books that are featured in this video. So definitely check out those other videos where you can hear me talk more about these books. But right now I'm just going to give you my general overall thoughts of which book goes in which category. So yes, and then the second book that I really loved and is an honorable mention is I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. So as you guys know, and you can see behind me, I am an illustrator. If you didn't know, I am an illustrator, and I do author portraits and I sell them on my Etsy shop. I was working on drawing my author portrait for Maya Angelou, and one of my favorite things that I love to do is listen to an audiobook by that author while I draw their portrait, just because it feels kind of like a conversation, like I'm actually speaking to or listening to the person that I'm drawing. It's like they're really there with me while I draw them. And I listened to I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou while I drew her portrait, and it was such a special experience, and it really became one of my favorite books, and I would love to read more from her. So yes, those are my first two honorable mentions, both incredible, and I highly recommend them. Of course, I highly recommend all of the books that I will be talking about. Now getting into the categories of specific favorites, the first category is a noteworthy old to me author. So an author that I have read before, but I read a lot of their works this year, and that goes to Neil Gaiman. I read so many wonderful Neil Gaiman books this year. This is a box set actually. It has The Graveyard Book, Coraline, and Fortunately the Milk. I have read Coraline before in previous years, but I didn't read it this year. This year I did read The Graveyard Book and Fortunately the Milk. I also read Neverwhere, which is so great, and you'll see that later on in this video. And I also read a picture book by Neil Gaiman called Instructions, and you'll see that as well later on in the video. But I adore Neil Gaiman. I love his writing. I love his world building. I love his characters. I love everything that he does. I think he's one of the greatest living writers that we have, and I highly recommend checking out Neil Gaiman if you haven't. I feel like there is no really great place to start with him. I feel like just read any Neil Gaiman book and they are incredible. I adore Neil Gaiman. I actually have been listening to his masterclass on writing, and I am loving it, and I love getting his advice on writing, and just taking in his stories is one of my favorite things to do as a reader. The next category is a new to me favorite author, and this author I discovered in 2023, and I have been adoring her books, and that is Claire Keegan. Claire Keegan is an Irish author, and I read the first book you will see later on in the video. I read Small Things Like These, and then I read this book, Foster, and I am in the middle of reading Antarctica, which is her short story collection. I am just in love with her writing. I think that all of her stories are so impactful, so incredible. She writes quite short form. All of her novels are pretty short, and this is short stories, but this is a novel. It's quite short. She packs such a punch in such a quiet way. Her books are so subtle but so profound. Her writing is just so incredibly enchanting and beautiful and masterful, and she just is she is just a genius. So please, please, please read Claire Keegan. I cannot recommend her enough. I've been talking about her quite a lot on my channel recently because I've just been adoring everything that she has written. So yes, my favorite author probably of 2023 is Claire Keegan. New to me, but probably my favorite author. She is definitely one of those authors where it's an instant buy for me. I will literally buy anything that she's ever written. The next category is the book that I was most surprised by, and that definitely has to go to The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. So I first read this book in high school and I absolutely hated it. It was my least favorite book on the planet. And then I reread it this year for the Game of Tomes book club, which I co-host with my best friend Emma from her YouTube channel Emmy, who I adore. We reread, or I reread, she read for the first time, The Catcher in the Rye, and I loved it. And I filmed a whole vlog so you can hear all of my thoughts about it. It's non-spoilery, so you can watch it even if you haven't read The Catcher in the Rye. But I was so surprised by how much I enjoyed this book, and I still can't believe it to this day. It's just so great. And I keep thinking to myself, like, if my high school self could see me now, she'd be like, what are you thinking? How can you like this book? But highly recommend checking out The Catcher in the Rye. I feel like it is one of those books where if you read it in high school and hated it, I highly recommend rereading it because I feel like it's one of those books where you can really grow with it. And when you get older, when you have different perspectives, you can see the intricacies and the beauty of the character development. And Holden as a character, I think, is just very misunderstood. And I think that's the charm of his character. But again, my high school self absolutely hated him, hated this book, and I just think it's hilarious that I really, really love it now. It's one of my favorite classics, so highly recommend checking it out. Again, you can hear all of my thoughts in that vlog that I filmed for this book specifically. So that is The Catcher in the Rye. The next category is my favorite illustrator of the year, and this is an illustrator who is new to me. I have been following his work on Instagram for a couple of years now, but I picked up his books this year, both of his books that are out, and that is Luke Adam Hawker. The Last Tree, A Seed of Hope by Luke Adam Hawker, and then Together. I believe that he worked with someone else on the words for this book. Let me just double check. Yes, so it says with words by Mary Ann Laidlaw, and then I think he might have written this one. Yes, I believe he wrote The Last Tree, A Seed of Hope, and then this one he worked with Mary Ann Laidlaw, but his illustrations are so fantastic. I highly recommend checking him out on Instagram. He posts so many wonderful reels and pictures of his illustrations. He works a lot with fine line ink pen, and just his detail and the way that he creates stories through images is so beautiful, and I just really, really loved both of these books, so highly recommend checking them out. I think that his work is fantastic. The next category is my favorite new to me poetry collection, and that has to go to Fernando Pessoa's I Have More Souls Than One. This is a Penguin Little Modern. They have the mint green ones, and they also have the Penguin Little Black Classics, which I love so much. But this one is a small poetry collection of Fernando Pessoa's poems. I haven't read Pessoa before reading this, and I absolutely loved his writing. He is a fantastic Portuguese author, and I just adored every single poem. They were so lyrical, beautifully written. The sentiments that he captured in these poems were really relatable. Also, some of them weren't relatable, but they were so beautiful in putting myself in his shoes, and everything that he wrote about really resonated with me. So I'm really looking forward to reading more Pessoa in 2024. I would love to read the Book of Disquiet, so I hope that I will prioritize that one for 2024. But yes, my favorite poetry collection has to go to I Have More Souls Than One by Fernando Pessoa. Before I continue on with the next category, a quick word from our lovely sponsor, Skillshare. I'd like to say a huge thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Skillshare is a learning platform filled with thousands of classes on any kind of creative skill you can imagine. They even have hundreds of wonderful career-focused classes too. One of Skillshare's goals is to help people answer the question, where should I begin my learning journey when I have a goal I want to achieve? Knowing it can often be daunting to sort through thousands of resources on other content platforms. The great thing about Skillshare is that it's the one-stop shop for carefully curated content created by industry pros and designed with your creative learning goals in mind. Currently, I'm in the process of formatting and designing my own illustrated novel in Adobe InDesign. So when I saw that Skillshare had a learning path called Go from Beginner to Intermediate in Adobe InDesign, I was ecstatic. So I can't recommend you to check out the link below enough. The first 500 people who click the link below can get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Thank you again to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. What you're doing for creative people is amazing. The next category is my favorite rereads of the year, and the first one has to go to A Farewell to Arms, and then the second one has to go to Yevgeny Onegin. So, A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway, and Yevgeny Onegin by Alexander Pushkin. So, two very, very different books. A Farewell to Arms is a historical fiction set during World War I. Yes, during World War I, had to double check. This is one of my favorite books. I think if you haven't read any Ernest Hemingway before, I would highly recommend starting with A Farewell to Arms. It is my favorite Hemingway. I have read so much Hemingway, so I do consider myself a slight expert in the Hemingway universe, and I always tell people to start with A Farewell to Arms or A Movable Feast. A Movable Feast is nonfiction, but it is fantastic. It's about his time in Paris, but A Farewell to Arms is fiction. It's based on his experience during World War I working as an ambulance driver. He did get injured. The characters in this book, they are ambulance drivers and doctors and surgeons, and one of them does get injured. Many of them get injured because it's obviously the war, but I would highly, highly recommend checking out this book. I reread it for the first time this year, had an incredible time rereading it. I read it for the book club that Emma and I co-host, Game of Tomes, and it was just fantastic. I loved my reread, and this still stands as my favorite Hemingway book, tied first place with A Movable Feast. And then we have Yevgeny Onegin. This is a Russian classic. It is a novel in verse, and it is, I will still stand by this because I reread it and I still agree with myself when I first read it, that this is one of the most beautifully written books I've ever read. It is so lyrical, of course, because it is written in poetic rhyme. It is a novel, but it's written in verse. And it is just so incredibly moving and beautiful and human, and oh, it's heartbreaking and hopeful and gorgeous, and the words just bloom on the pages, and you could just feel every emotion in this book. I did film a whole reading vlog of me reading this book for the first time, so you can check that out, but I still love this book so much. I read it for the first time, I think in 2021, and then I reread it for the first time in 2023, and I still absolutely adore it, so this was definitely a favorite reread for me. If you haven't picked it up, I highly recommend doing so. You don't have to be an expert in Russian literature, you don't have to be an expert in poetry. It's such an easy book to just sink into. It's so beautiful, and I think it would honestly be a great introduction to Russian literature and poetry if you are not too familiar with Russian literature or poetry. But yes, one of my favorites, love it so much. This next book is my favorite nonfiction of the year. It was actually sent to me by my amazing cousin Megan. So Megan, thank you so much. She loved this book, and then she sent it to me, and I adored it so much. I think it might be top 3 favorite books of 2023. Oh, I adore it so much. I actually didn't even physically read it. I listened to the audiobook, and the audiobook was amazing, phenomenal, fantastic, incredible, just every single amazing synonym that you can think of. So that is The Anthropocene Reviewed, or The Anthropocene, yes, The Anthropocene Reviewed by John Green. This is actually a signed edition, which is so cool. This is a nonfiction. It's essays on a human-centered planet, and this is a fantastic book filled with a bunch of different essays about a bunch of different random things that John Green has to talk about, and they're just so fantastic. I listened to the audiobook that is narrated by John Green. Cannot recommend it enough. His idea for this book is that he talks about different aspects of life, different things that he has experienced, and he rates them on a 5-star scale. So one of the categories, like one of the chapters, is Diet Dr. Pepper, and at the end of the chapter he says, I give Diet Dr. Pepper 4 out of 5 stars. And then he talks about, before his rating, he talks about just what he has to say about that specific thing. There are so many different things that he talks about in here that I loved so much, and they were even like topics that I never really gave much thought to, or he presented them in a new way, which really just expanded my mind and my thoughts of them. Some of my favorite chapters are Sunsets. I also love the chapter, it's probably my favorite, Auld Lang Syne, the New Year's Eve song, or the New Year's song. There are so many, just so many great ones. He has one on the Notes app, he has one on sycamore trees, he has some on whispering, Monopoly, Super Mario Kart. So there are just like a bunch of random topics, but the way that he explores them, the way that he talks about them is just so fantastic. Can you tell I love this book? I just want to reread it. I think I definitely will reread it in 2024. Just adore it, highly recommend it, please read it. One of my favorite books of this year. Or 2023. It is now 2024. The next category is my favorite children's book of the year, and that is to a book that I don't actually have a physical copy of, and that is Instructions by Neil Gaiman. Again, I mentioned this earlier, Instructions is a children's picture book that I listened to the audiobook of actually, and it is instructions given to someone on a quest, but it's really symbolized by life. Like the quest is just the journey of living, and the advice that Neil Gaiman gives, the way that he puts it, like a fairy tale spin on it, was just so fantastic, and I absolutely loved Instructions, and I highly recommend checking it out. I am an advocate for children's literature, even if you're an adult. Even more so if you're an adult. Children's literature is just so impactful, and this book is a perfect example of that. Moving on to my favorite middle grade book. This is by one of my favorite authors, my favorite illustrators. He has had such an incredible impact on my life as an illustrator, and he basically is one of the reasons why I am an illustrator today, because I discovered his work when I was 9, and he came out with this book this year, and I read it and I adored it, and it is so amazing, and that is Big Tree by Brian Selznick. Brian Selznick's work never ceases to amaze me. He is a writer and an illustrator, and his books are just so beautifully done. He is such an inspiration for me, and I love his work. So Big Tree is fantastic. It says, an epic adventure from one of the most innovative storytellers of our time. Again, like Neil Gaiman, Brian Selznick, his work is some of my favorites. I love his storytelling, I love his world building, I love his characters, and the way that he illustrates. He's such a brilliant mind, and again, I love hearing him speak. I'm always looking for podcasts that he's been on, and videos and interviews that are on YouTube, just because I find so much inspiration in what he has to say about illustrating and storytelling. And yes, so this book is fantastic. Also, there is an incredible audiobook which is narrated by Meryl Streep, which is just the coolest thing. So yes, love Big Tree, one of my all-time favorite books of this year, by one of my all-time favorite authors and illustrators. The next category is my favorite young adult book, and that goes to a graphic novel. That is Heartstopper Volume 5. I adore the Heartstopper series. These are by Alice Oseman, who I just think is such an incredible writer and illustrator. This series is so beautiful, so lovely, just so comforting. When I'm in the pages of the Heartstopper series, I am just so joyful. And that's all that I can really ask for from certain books, is just give me comfort and joy. So yes, Heartstopper Volume 5. I read it this year, I loved it this year, it is so fantastic, and I highly recommend checking out the Heartstopper series. I just simply adore it. The next category goes to my favorite fantasy book of the year, and that is Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. I told you guys that you would see this book later on, and here it is. So Neverwhere is such a fantastic story. The world building is phenomenal. It is just so captivating and inspiring, and it's about these dual Londons, and we have London above, which is like normal London, and then we have London below, which is a very different, more fantastical, magical London. And someone from London above, like a normal guy, finds himself going into London below, which really people from London above don't really go to London Below, or they don't even know that it's there, and he discovers London Below, and the adventures kind of go on from there. This is a beautiful illustrated edition. This is illustrated by Chris Riddell. Like I said, Chris Riddell works a lot with Neil Gaiman, and I love his work so much, so highly, highly, highly recommend. The quote on the back says, "Have you seen this girl? Answers to the name of Doreen. Bites and kicks. Run away. Tell us if you saw her. Want her back. Reward paid." So again, it is about this character getting kind of intertwined in this girl, Doreen, or Dor's life, and she is from London Below. So it is just so fantastic. Highly recommend it. And it's just, yeah, oh god, I want to reread it right now. It's so good. The next category is my favorite classics of the year. You guys know, or if you don't know, I am a huge classics reader. I love classics so much. The first one I read while I was in Canada visiting Emma, so I don't have a physical copy because I read her copy, and that is Chess by Stefan Zweig. I loved Chess so much. It is fiction involving like some military intrigue and chess, and I don't want to say too much else. It is quite a short novel, so I don't want to give too much away, but it's beautiful. You can hear me talk about it, and you could see me read it in a vlog. While I was visiting Emma, we did a 24-hour readathon, and I read it for that video. But yes, loved it so much. Definitely want a physical copy so I can reread it at some point. And then the next one that I want to tell you about is Orlando by Virginia Woolf. I read Orlando for the first time this year because of our book club, and Orlando blew me away. It is so innovative and so ahead of its time. It is about this character who, at the start of the novel, he's a young nobleman in Queen Elizabeth's court, and then by the end of the novel he goes through a transformation and he actually becomes a woman. And it is just so incredible the way that Virginia Woolf kind of manipulates time and manipulates gender and sex and just like the character development, and just the arc of this story almost feels like this, but it also feels like this. I am a huge fan of Virginia Woolf and highly recommend checking out Orlando. It's just so mind-blowing, so yes. The next one I have here, we also read for the Game of Tomes book club, and that is The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Again, we read this for the book club. There is a whole video discussion that Emma and I filmed when I was in Canada, when we were in person, and we had a really, really great discussion about this book and the meaning of life and religion and just your perspective on being a human, your perspective on just life as a whole. It has left me speechless. It left me with so many thoughts, and I think that's the thing about this book that I took away the most, was how thought-provoking it was, and it dabbled on topics that I haven't really thought too much about before, or maybe I thought about in passing, and it really made you question those things. Fyodor Dostoevsky is one of my favorite Russian writers, and I just think The Brothers Karamazov is I don't know, just a masterpiece. Then the last category is my favorite contemporary books of the year, or books that were published more recently, and that goes to 3 books. You can see the first one already. That is Claire Keegan's Small Things Like These. So this is the first book that I read by Claire Keegan. This is the book that made me fall in love with her writing, and is the book that made me want to read everything she's ever written. Again, it's such a quiet novel, but it is so impactful, and it touched on a time in history that I'd never known about in Ireland. It's also being turned into a movie where the main character is being played by Cillian Murphy. I can't wait to watch it. Oh my gosh. I also know that Foster, you guys told me Foster was adapted into a movie called The Quiet Girl, and I hope to read that very, very soon. But can't wait for this, can't wait to reread this book, and can't wait to watch the movie. So yes, adore Small Things Like These. Probably my favorite book of the year if I had to pick one. Yes, but that's so difficult because I love these next 2 books as well. So the next book I read this year is my first book by this author, and that is Murakami's Norwegian Wood. This was my first Murakami. This is one of my boyfriend's favorite books, and I read it this year and I really, really loved it. It's such a fantastic coming-of-age book. set in Tokyo, and it touched on a lot of difficult topics like mental health and young relationships, or just trying to figure out like who you are in university time, so when you're like early 20s. And I feel like it is such a difficult age. Even now I'm 25 and there are so many questions about like what is life going to be like in 5 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years. It's just such a strange time in your life where you're just trying to figure everything out, and I think it's beautifully illustrated in this book, is just trying to figure out life, and I think it's beautifully done, beautifully written, and I'm very much looking forward to reading more Murakami in 2024. The last book that I have to tell you guys about that is part of my favorite contemporary books, that is The Housekeeper and the Professor by Yoko Ogawa. This is from the beautiful Vintage Japan series. All of my books just fell. So this is from Vintage Japan. I love this series from Vintage. They are just such beautiful editions. This book deals a lot with memory loss, short-term memory, and character relationships. We follow this math professor who has an 80 or a 90-minute memory. Yes, an 80-minute memory, and we follow the housekeeper who helps keep his house, and the housekeeper's son and their relationship with one another. It is so beautifully done. It left me just so heartbroken, but also just it left me so happy, so heartbroken and happy to be heartbroken. And the symbolism of the weeping willow tree with all of the like pieces of paper attached to it, perfect character design, perfect cover design. It's just so beautiful. Also the three birds, the three swallows, just the cover means so much. And the inside cover, one of the things that the characters bond over is baseball, and just the character relationships in this book I think are my favorite thing about it, and the way that Yoko Ogawa deals with the short-term memory, because I'm very much interested in memory loss. Such an incredible book. Highly recommend picking it up, of course, if you haven't. And I really want to read more from Yoko Ogawa as well. So those are all of the books. Those are all of my favorite books from 2023. There are so many, and they're all over the place because they just fell. I don't think I'm going to be able to pick all of them up, but here are some of them. So I hope that you enjoyed listening to me talk about these books. Again, I would love to know what your favorite books were from 2023. Definitely let me know in the comments. Make your own categories if you want. And yes, so excited for 2024. I can't wait to see what my favorite books are of this year. It's so exciting to think about all the amazing books that you're going to read. Thank you so much for watching this video. Again, a huge thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring it. You guys are amazing, and just thank you so much. And I hope you're having a fantastic day. I am sending you my very best wishes, and as always, happy reading. Again, one-armed wave because I'm holding the books.